What's up, fight fans? It's your boy Jack Slack. Fights Gone By Podcast 111, or Fights Gone By Podcast Ill. A joke that your grandmother would have told there. One of Ken Dodd's best. It's the 20th of December, and we're going to be walking it over the line. The last episode before Christmas. A few little bitty things to talk about, and we'll do some questions, and we'll ramble, and then I'll get out of here. I've had a fairly fun week. I was down in Hay-on-Wye, yeah, the place that's famous for the book festival. Book festival wasn't on, but I went to all the fancy bookshops. Lots and lots of... it's interesting, every bookshop seems to have... Every, good second-hand bookshop seems to have a boxing section, whereas if you go into a Waterstones, there'll be, 3 boxing books next to the other sports books. So I got some cool stuff, got some more List and Ali stuff, which is always good, because we've got the episode coming out on the 26th, Boxing Day. If you don't have that in America, it's actually called Boxing Day. But picked up some really cool stuff. Found a book on Old Q for £2. Ancient old book. Old Q was the first Marquess of Queensberry. And I don't think it's come out yet. I wrote ages ago for Battles of London an article on the Queensberry rules and the history of the Queensberries. The famous mad bad line, as Oscar Wilde called them. And Old Q's a fascinating character because he came into several peerages, titles, but had fuck all else. He didn't inherit anything. So he made a fortune for himself through betting on horses and breeding horses and making these extravagant wagers. He was the kind of guy who just sat in a coffee house and said, yeah, I bet I could... the famous one was transport a message over 5 miles in under 45 minutes or something like that. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was impossible for the day. And so when he was called out on this, he said, meet me here. And they met at an old, a meadow. And he'd got a local cricket team to stand around the perimeter, attached this message to a cricket ball, and had them just whip it around the entire perimeter several times in way under the time that he said. Fascinating character, Old Q. So yeah, that was a pretty good pickup. What else did I get? Some lovely folios. I fucking love the Folio Society. It used to be my favourite thing to get at Christmas, a Folio Society book. And I just walked into this place and they had hundreds of them all lined up on the wall for almost nothing, in great condition. It's an amazing place. If you ever get a chance, go down to Hay-on-Wye, especially if you have a big book collection like me. Actually, looking at it now, I've pretty much filled one wall with fighting and boxing and martial arts books, so it's probably time I got another lot of bookshelves. Oh, I also got an old Lonsdale guide to boxing, part of the Lonsdale Library, by a chap called Nebworth, and I'd never seen it before. It's got stills of Tunney and people in action from their actual fights to illustrate stuff. Yeah, I'd never seen it before, and I looked at it, and it was unreasonably expensive, but I still went for it because if there's a boxing manual that I've never heard of, and it's quite clearly old, I don't want anyone else having it. So I picked that up, and I was chatting to all these shopkeepers, and one of them was, they're all moaning about how nobody really goes to bookshops anymore. And I'm thinking about halfway through, you're just giving me the spiel because this town is famous for bookshops. And I'm talking to this old dude, and he's just been moaning about how no one uses bookshops anymore. And I was feeling a little sorry for him. And then I said, beautiful shop you have here. And he was like, thanks, it's 0.25% of our stock. And I was like, oh? And he said, yeah, we send out 15,000 books a week online. And so I was just like, I actually don't feel sorry for you at all. So that's what I've been up to this weekend. Expect new, references to whoever this Nebworth guy is, like he's as good as Edwin Hazlitt. But what's going on in the news? Sabot versus Jeremy Stevens is signed. That's good. I had to lead with that because this is the Sabot podcast. This is a really good fight. People think I hate Sabot, but I don't at all. It's this. He beats no one and then people are like, well, it's because everyone's ducking him, and they aren't. Like, there's no proof anyone's ducking him. But then, Jeremy Stephens is not a guy to duck anyone, so, I'm sure he signed the thing at the moment they offered it to him. Stephens coming off that loss to Aldo, but before that, was on a pretty good run for him. He's such an inconsistent fighter, but he just stopped Doo Ho Choi and Josh Emmett. Meanwhile, Sabot coming off wins over nobodies, but still, super hyped. And, it's interesting looking at this fight because some of the things that Stephens does match up badly for Sabot, you would think. Two of Zabot's really noticeable habits, fading down the stretch and backing straight onto the fence. And he does it a lot, and then the opponent takes double underhooks and he throws them by a whizzer, which is something you can do if you are significantly better than the opponent. But you can't always rely on that. Like, if you give, who are we going to say? If you give Chad Mendes double underhooks on you, you're not going to throw him around by it. It's just not happening, even if you're 6'3" and he's 5'0", or whatever he is. Meanwhile, Stephens has always been undone by lateral movement. You can watch anyone from Moicano to, I don't know, there's hundreds of people who've beaten him. But, you move on Stephens, he struggles. He doesn't really have ring cutting. He follows you around and swings as hard as he can for 3 rounds. And fair play to him, because he still hits, he throws everything into every punch, and he still does it through 3 to 5 rounds. The guy's conditioning is really good for, a swinger, basically, an all-out haymaker kind of guy. One of the things I like that he's added recently is that low kick. It's a nice way to slow people down and stand them in front of you if you don't really have the ring cutting. But then if the guy's going to back straight onto the fence, do you necessarily need the ring cutting? That's the interesting question in this one. And Stephens has good takedown defense. He's not a legendary wrestler, but he's a good wrestler. And he's a good wrestler when he's aware that the opponent might wrestle. He has a tendency to do the Dan Henderson thing where you're going forward, swinging at the guy, he's swinging back, so you forget all about your hips and then they just duck on it. He's sprawled on good guys, but he's also been taken down by Anthony Pettis. So, yeah, he's a hit-and-miss character. But fun. I think that's one of the better... I'm trying to work out, who would be a better matchup for Sabot as, a test, also sort of trying to get him into contention as quickly as possible. Because the top end of that division, a lot of nasty dudes there. You got Chad Mendes versus Volkanovski coming up, which is going to be a terrific fight. And Volkanovski's a bit of an oddity because he's not got a wrestling background, but he comes from kickboxing, but he uses ringcraft really well and then uses these few takedowns along the fence over and over again, and then pairs them in with good strikes on the break. What else happened? I was reading a piece from Sport Business Daily. Don't know if that's a reputable site or not. But it was about PFL and how they got a big year planned next year. They're going to do another $1 million prize tournament. I think, didn't they just book another New Year's Eve event? Like the time that they bankrupted themselves last time when they were World Series of Fighting. Anyway, this article, which was like a fluff piece about how well they're doing, also managed to note that they've made no money and that they're selling their tickets for $20, like all of them, front row tickets and things. Just classic PFL. That's what they were when they were World Series of Fighting. Great fights, never drew a dime. Just engaged in World Series of Fighting. Broke 1,000 legs, never drew a dime. Dajon, or DAZN, which I really hate saying, moves to the top of the App Store and Google Play as the top free app. And the article I read was attributing this to Canelo, the pound-for-pound number one in the sport, except Lomachenko and maybe Bud Crawford. But, the big draw in boxing. And Bellator 213, McFarlane versus Letourneau. One of those, I'm guessing, had a bigger impact on the downloads than the other. Vitor Belfort came out and announced that he's ready to come back as a free agent in 2019. This was one of those, I'm going to announce an announcement, and the announcement is that offer me things. I laugh, but it worked for Cheeky Chappy Chatry. He announced that they were definitely being offered a TV deal, and then got offered a TV deal based on pretending that he'd been offered one. But yeah, Vitor back. Everyone knows that he'll be on the juice, but everyone wants to see him on the juice. So let him get on the juice and come back to Bellator. He's saying he's a free agent, so, I expect he's hammering out the details of a contract, but there's no way Bellator passes up on him. Liddell versus Ortiz 3. more news on that. $732,000 were made at the gate, but only 5,400 tickets were sold. 1,500 tickets were comped, so that works out at like $300 a ticket. So some real fudging of figures there, but either way, they didn't do great. What else is going on? John Jones turned down VADA testing, which the California State Athletic Commission has recommended he do additionally, and he was just like, no thanks. Oh god, VADA or WADA or whatever it is. Max Kellerman was talking about this like 2 years ago. They catch people. SADA, they do catch people, but it always tends to be people fairly far down the card, and if they do catch someone at the top of the card, somehow they work out that it was a tainted supplement or something like that. Jones just has a freedom to roid now. It's pretty sad. Dominic Cruz is going to be out for another year. Tore his shoulder ligaments while throwing a punch or something like that. I tell you, there's going to be boxing coaches across the country going, yeah, that's exactly why you don't do that. The whole time that Dominic Cruz was succeeding, we were all going, wow, he's so unique. But there were all these people being like, no, that loopy punching form and that weird footwork is going to get into trouble. And to be fair, his knees and shoulders have both fallen apart. But, you can't argue with results. But then the results are also getting injured. So, unlucky Dom Cruz. He's a cool guy. I'd like to see him back in action. But thankfully, this does mean that Assunção and Moraes may now get a title shot, whichever one of them wins that fight. Both of them deserve a title shot, but for some reason the UFC were just angling for a Dominic Cruz return once again. Luke Rockhold's talking about going up to light heavyweight, having seen the success of Anthony Smith, and, Thiago Santos, fair enough. I think most of us agree, his whole problem is that his... some people are going to point to the chin, but it's mainly that his boxing's terrible. I think, if you're going to take those shots, at least don't cut off an arm and a leg to make weight. We've seen that hundreds and hundreds of times that you're better off just not cutting the weight and you'll take a shot better. Typically. Oh, and one championship, whatever they are, they have announced that they're going to be debuting Johnson and Alvarez on the same card, against nobodies, but, that's these guys coming off losses, in fact. But that's expected, and everyone's going mad for it. They're like, oh my god, I can't wait to see Eddie Alvarez and Demetrius Johnson smash some bums. Smashing bums is a little bit different in the UK. Oh, and Anderson Silva called for a fight against Conor McGregor again, in the same week that he was accusing George St. Pierre of running from him. Just wants to fight small people. That's what he's after now. What a strange character. You can never tell, if a headline is taking Anderson Silva out of context. And sometimes you'll read it and go, oh, okay, well, no, he didn't actually say that. And then sometimes you'll read it and just go, that's bizarre. Was he making weird actions with his eyebrows when he said that? Was he really, tongue-in-cheek? Always been an odd dude, though, and he gets hit in the head for a living, so you can expect him to be a little bit odd. Oh, and DC won ESPN's Fighter of the Year. That's nice. Though Fighter of the Year is always a fucking joke. He says, as he writes his own fighter and fight and stuff of the year for Vice. So what did I watch this weekend? Bellator 212 was all right, and then UFC Fight Night Lee vs. Quinta was pretty good too. And I didn't watch Bellator 213 because Valerie Letourneau in a world title fight in a main event. It wasn't good when it happened in the UFC. I suspect it wasn't good when it happened in Bellator either. But yeah, I caught up on Chandler versus Primus. As always, I'm going to say it because I turned on the event and I immediately went, oh my god, Big John and Goldie are the worst booth I've ever heard. What did I watch? Sam Cecilia versus Derek Campos was fun enough. Derek Campos is just a nasty dude. He tries to butt people with his head as they come in on him. AJ McKee tapped out Daniel Crawford. Daniel Crawford didn't seem particularly great, but they're bringing AJ McKee along slowly. Javier Ayala beat Frank Mir, which I think puts him as having a win over Sergey Kharitonov and Frank Mir. Yes, but he lost to Roy Nelson and Chet Congo. What a weird position to be in. And Thiago Santos knocked him out. Is that the same Thiago Santos? Maybe. Thiago Santos has been down to welterweight, though. So he's been up at heavyweight as well. I'm very confused. But, at any rate, Frank Mir came out, I saw him at Quintet 3, which I'm always raving about, but he was the worst part of that card. He came out in no shape to compete, and he was disqualified for 4 warnings for stalling. But suddenly, he's back into shape, he's ripped, and he's ready to go fighting again a month later, because Bellator, they don't really care if you do the roids. And yeah, he looked all right for the opening part, and then in classic Mir fashion faded, and Javier Valla pushed him to the fence like Big Nog did. If you're getting dirty boxed along the fence by Big Nog, that's a weakness of yours. So yeah, he's just beating him up there. Nice body shots from Ayala, or Avana, or whatever his name is, Javi. Frank Mir had his 15-year-old daughter in his corner, and Mike Goldberg said, and he'll fight harder because he's got his 15-year-old daughter in his corner. Something which made no sense at all. And then Frank Mir lost his mouthpiece, got hit in the mouth, and submitted to strikes in the clinch. Some people shitting on him for this, tapping to strikes while standing. And some people shitting on it, some people saying, oh my god, you're a heavyweight and you've lost your mouthpiece. Yeah, fair enough. I think it's a bit of both. I think he should retire, but also fair enough. If you're getting smashed by someone's gigantic ham fists while you've got no mouthpiece in, I'd be worried about that too, especially if I was an American and I really, really cared about orthodontistry. But yeah, well done Ayala, being the spoiler of Bellator's heavyweight division. Put him in with Fedor. He might knock him out. He would smash Chael Sonnen, which is the standard for getting into the final of the heavyweight Grand Prix, after all. Then in your main event, Michael Chandler met Brent Primus. Yeah, this was the super weird one, because it was a payoff to a year-long rivalry that came out of nowhere because Chandler lost that fight weirdly by turning his ankle, and then the referee called time to have the doctor check his ankle, something you can't do. It was like when the referee allowed Travis Brown to call time on his finger or eye poke, his finger being broken. You don't call time for anything except groin shots and, fouls, basically. You don't call time except for fouls. Otherwise, you stop the fight, and you're basically giving a TKO. That's what that should be. I'd never seen that happen, and he did it in this fight. And not only did he, end the fight and not give Chandler a chance to fight back, he robbed Brent Primus of the stoppage. People were always going to shit on Primus because Michael Chandler turned his ankle. But if Primus had swarmed in and finished him, that would at least be intriguing. Whereas it was just, he turned his ankle, stop the fight. But yeah, this was underwhelming is what I'd say. Michael Chandler in this fight was stepping into this really deep stance and throwing jab, right hand, really deep, really narrow, as in on a line. And it was more pronounced than I've ever seen. I was thinking, my goodness, his head is just on a line every time he steps in really deep. He's not particularly well balanced. If he gets hit with a counter jab or something like that, when he's doing that, he might fall over. And then immediately Brent Primus did that. Every time he jabbed with Chandler, because Chandler always jabs and then throws the right hand, he steps in with the jab. Steps deep with the jab, rather. If you jab with him, you're probably going to have some good success. Ken Norton, Muhammad Ali style. Don't try and pick up on when he's jabbing and pick them off. Pick up on when he's stepping in, because the jab will come with it, and then you just dip your head and jab at the same time, or right hand high and jab at the same time. In fact, Sergio Pettis and Rob Font, there was some interesting stuff regarding that in their fight this week. But yeah, then it came down to the takedowns, and Chandler just took him down and leaned on him along the fence. Dropped a couple of elbows, but it was all closed guard stuff. It was exactly the same as his fight with Goiti Yamauchi. Goiti? Yeah, Goiti Yamauchi. And it just made me think Primus isn't doing any sort of wall walking here. Habib Nurmagomedov is considered the best guy in the world at holding people down. But even he, against guys like Edson Barbosa, where he was just miles ahead of the guy, Edson Barbosa was standing up, wall walking, or trying to, all through that fight. The whole catching the arm behind the back thing and stuff like that Habib's known for, or the sitting on the one ankle as the opponent's trying to stand up along the fence and dragging that leg behind them. That's because guys are moving. Habib has to do that. Habib doesn't hold people down in closed guard. I'm just wondering, is the level that much below the UFC level in Bellator? I'm going to have to rewatch those Will Brooks fights to see if Chandler just couldn't take him down, or if Brooks was getting up or whatever. Can't remember much of them except Chandler doing the chill dog, getting hit and then going time out because he was that rocked. Chandler's the top student of Neil Melanson. So, I have enormous respect for Neil Melanson. Maybe he is just that good, but I was watching this and going, why is he just being held down in closed guard? Why is he not doing anything? And the same with Yamauchi, to be honest. But this is like the conclusion of the Michael Chandler revenge angle. He was always basically, even while Primus was the champion, he was out for a year, and Chandler was still seen as the champion because of the silly nature of the first fight, or the bizarre nature rather of the first fight. So now he doesn't have like a revenge angle. That was all that made Primus Chandler interesting. There's no one left for him to fight, and he turned down the UFC's offer. Oh, hilarious! John McCarthy he's listing the names out of Missouri's wrestling, like Tyron Woodley, Ben Askren, Michael Chandler, and he says they must feed them something down there before awkwardly remembering that Bellator doesn't really drug test. As much as USADA is a joke, at the middling levels, and unless you're a superstar and you get like a special dispensation afterwards, they do actually test you, whereas Bellator doesn't. Bellator does what is mandatory for the commission, and sometimes goes to places where the commission is just useless, or doesn't even have a commission. And Chandler, like, if you've looked at him, I wouldn't care, but it's when he's like, I think I'm the best matchup for Khabib out there, he says immediately after re-signing with Bellator. He doesn't want to be tested by his competition, and he doesn't want to be tested in his blood work either. Then there was Kevin Lee versus Alakinta 2, UFC on Fox, the last UFC on Fox. They kept saying, like, thank you, Fox, and flashing up stats for the 7 years. 7 years, 140-something knockouts. That seemed quite low for me, given how many events there are. Maybe they weren't counting Fox Sports 1, because it's less than 25 a year. Who knows? There were so many, like, different things, like Fox Sports 1. They do the odd Fight Pass card, and then they've got all the pay-per-views in as well. Yeah, I suppose sort of the end of an era. Now they're not going to be on TV anymore, and instead going to be, I think they've got like 10 cards on TV per year, and then a load on streaming service that I don't know if anyone actually has. But at least they're not on 11 Sports. God, that was going to be awful. I had to find out what 11 Sports was, but thankfully BT Sports have bought the rights again. Or 11 Sports just realised that they didn't actually have a channel yet. What went on this UFC card? Hey, Chris De La Rocha was in. He's a big old Mexican with a big old head. Some of these I didn't see. Jack Hermansson submitted Gerald Meerschaert. Always liked Jack Hermansson. I liked him when he came in and he was boxing some lad up, and then I found out that he was a really experienced Greco guy. Draco Close and Bobby Green completed that love triangle between Green, Close, and Venata. Bobby Green retired after this. He was always going to be, for me, one of those big wasted potential sort of guys. There were fights where it was like an Emmanuel Augustus thing. He showed you very clever stuff and crafty stuff. He'd show you his shoulder rolls and stuff, and you're going, wow, that's pretty cool that you can get away with that. And then rather than shoulder roll come back with counters, it was shoulder roll, perform shaking dust off shoulder action and mean mug. And you're going, well, you're not using it for its purpose. Very frustrating fighter to watch. Zach Otto beat Dwight Grant by split decision. Oh, main card. We'll do main card because I watched all of these and they were actually really good. Charles Oliveira versus Jim Miller. I'll give you my thinking through this fight. Yep, Charles Oliveira's come out nice. He's circling away from Jim Miller's left hand, circling past the lead foot as he would against a southpaw. Obviously, Miller, not a particularly crisp striker, but can bang. He knocked down Dwayne Ludwig. Very nice that Charles Oliveira's doing that. And of course, Miller's low kicks are very surprising too, as Dustin Poirier found out. And then Jim Miller steps deep to kick, misses and does it all weird because Oliveira's floating past his lead leg at the time, and then somehow Jim Miller ends up turning his back, and Oliveira grabs a hold of it in a body lock, tries to lift him. Jim Miller grapevines the leg. Oliveira just high legs over that grapevine and then lifts him again. Looked beastly strong here. It was like watching, Kenny Omega or Brock Lesnar do the pick up lower, or what's his name, Jeff Cobb. He's fantastic, and didn't he wrestle Yoel Romero in amateur? But yeah, Jeff Cobb's a fantastic example of this, where he does the German suplex in the pro wrestling ring by picking the opponent up, holding it, lowering them back down with their feet off the floor so that they're like looking at the floor, and then doing the full suplex again. It was like that. He picked him up, stalled, and then dunked him. Got on his back, finished with the choke. Brilliant stuff. And I just remembered this is a rematch. I absolutely forgot that, because I was going to... Jim Miller is always the example I use of someone who's not always as pretty as some of the more spectacular grapplers, but he'll still mess you up. Like, because when Oliveira met Jim Miller the first time, I think he was a purple belt, and he was really highly touted. Oliveira, this is. And then he went to guard or whatever it was, and Jim Miller just tried to toe hold him and then knee barred him. And it was just like nasty, strong dude with a load more experience against a guy with a very pretty guard and some nice submissions. So mad props to Oliveira. I can't believe that escaped me. I think you could have made a great storyline out of that. Maybe they did. Maybe I just didn't watch it. Rob Font versus Sergio Pettis. Sergio Pettis continues being the most frustrating man in MMA. I say it every time, zero urgency. And it doesn't help that his corner, after he's lost 2 rounds, getting jabbed up, he goes back to his corner and they go, that was close. That was a close one. We definitely need this round. Not you're losing, try and knock him out. I think every round should begin with them going, try and knock him out, Sergio. Because Sergio Pettis is just so low pace and relaxed and chill. I think if you're going to get even a decent fight out of him, you've got to pretend every round you need the knockout. Rob Font was just jabbing his face off. Lovely stuff. Show the jab, feint the jab, show the jab. Getting Pettis freaking out all over the place, like reaching for the jab. When Pettis jabbed with Font, he caught Font and marked his eye up, which was nice. As in jab at the same time. Neither of them was doing a very good job of palming or slipping the opponent's jab, but Font was throwing way more jabs and lighting Sergio up. Sergio Pettis, I swear I've seen him fight southpaw. It's not just me conflating him and Anthony in my head. I think they are both capable of fighting southpaw. If you are having that much trouble with the jab, switch to southpaw and just have your right hand out on top of it the entire time. But he did nothing. They didn't change anything. If you're a Sergio Pettis fan, it's like me, against my better judgment. It's because he does cool things. You can't be a Sergio Pettis fan from watching highlights of him because he's never finished an opponent in the UFC. He's had like 18 fights there and never finished anyone because he doesn't have any urgency. He hurts dudes occasionally. He had a great performance against Joseph Benavidez, but the more that he fights, the more I think that was just because Joseph Benavidez looked awful in that fight. Don't think he threw like more than a handful of kicks in this fight. He did a cool thing where he failed on his usual tripod sweeps, but Font was holding one of his feet from open guard, and Pettis hit a technical stand-up while he still had his foot, and then did like a jumping wheel kick with the free leg, which was very cool, but isn't going to win you a fight if it doesn't land. So incredibly frustrating, but Rob Font looked fantastic. Edson Barbosa versus Dan Hooker. This is where the night gets a bit worse for the boys. So far, we've got Oliveira and Font winning Boy Club, but Boy Club loses the main and co-main event. Dan Hooker, I think I said this a couple of times, but I think I said it when it was announced mainly. This was a weird fight for Dan Hooker to call for because it's not his MO. His modus, what he's known for is slowing down very explosive, cool guys and drawing them out. Edson Barbosa is a guy who really likes a slow pace of fight because it allows him to stand in his stance and then rip your liver open with his shin. Edson Barbosa is not happy when people are in his face. And that's not just, people were saying, oh, thank God it's not another wrestler. But Beneil Dariush and Michael Johnson and Tony Ferguson all ran him ragged without wrestling him. They just walked him down and he couldn't get his stance set and he tried to kick while going backwards and it just didn't work. Dan Hooker started this fight out of range trying to low kick and jab and throw the left straight or the right straight or whatever it was. And it just, that is playing into Barbosa's game. Even when he was seeing the kicks coming and trying to check him, Barbosa would just punt his shin. When Dan Hooker moved forward later when he was hurt, he'd already been pounded in the body and it was like you could see he couldn't really put any sting on his punches or kicks. But when he was moving forward, he was still stopping Barbosa from working effectively. He got kneed in the gut a couple of times really hard with, from the double collar tie. But I think that's more to do with Dan Hooker being knackered before he even went to what would have worked. This fight definitely gives me new respect for Michael Johnson because even on the slump he's on, he's a guy with only a couple of things that he does. He's got good straight punches and good low kicks, but he's done that floating around at range, like when he was fading away from Poirier and coming back with counters. He's done that waiting for a lead and coming back with counter combinations as he did against Tony Ferguson, and he's done it where he just gets in the opponent's face and runs them ragged like he did against Edson Barbosa, whereas Dan Hooker wasn't able to put that sort of fight on Barboza. In fact, I think Dan Hooker would be able to put that sort of fight on Barboza, but I think it would be very uncomfortable for him because it's not his style. Edson Barboza in this fight looked amazing, but again, like, there was some ripplings of, oh, he's back after this fight, but he looked amazing because he was allowed to look amazing. If you watch the Dariush or the Johnson fight, or any of the other fights that he's lost, he can't work effectively if he's kept out of his stance. And he leaves his stance every time he has to move fast, like defensively. The Dariush fight's an amazing one, because every time he jabs Barboza leaves his stance, does a lap of the octagon, sets up his stance again, and Dariush just jabs him in the face again. Still, all the usual flaws are there for Barboza. Like, the commentators were going, and his boxing's looking so sharp, as Dan Hooker clutching his own gut, having just been jumping back kicked. Jumping back kick, nice touch from Barboza. Do that instead of wheel kicking every time, and you'll actually have a lot more success, I reckon. But yeah, Dan Hooker's walking forward, clutching his gut because he's almost vomiting. And Barboza's trying to swing at his head and missing these swings over and over as I think it was Felder was going, his boxing's looking so slick. But mad props to Dan Hooker for being just unbelievably tough and walking through all the punishment that he did. I hope he gets a more favourable stylistic matchup for the next one. He called for this one, they were saying afterwards, be careful what you wish for. He called for this one and then tried to fight his usual fight, which was very strange. But yeah, I mean, mad respect to Hooker. Props to Edson Barboza, because Edson Barboza, I think he's always going to be one of those guys where if you fight a fight that allows him to do what he does, he's always going to be one of the best in the world. But there are going to be guys who aren't nearly on the same level as him in terms of athleticism or ability to kick and punch, who can run him ragged by doing the same few things that trouble him. His footwork is still, meh. And then Al Iaquinta versus Kevin Lee. I thought this was a really interesting fight. Kevin Lee came on strong in the early going, had some big moments where he got the back and the body triangle. Al Iaquinta's submission defense on point all throughout. Kevin Lee got him in the worst possible position. Kevin Lee's finished Michael Chiesa, whose whole thing is grappling from there, and Al Iaquinta just relaxed, worked through it. Lee's hands looked sharp in the beginning, but he really did seem to, I don't want to say like fade, but because he seemed in good condition, but it seemed like Al Iaquinta grew as the fight went on and Kevin Lee shrank, in terms of confidence and going after it. And Al Iaquinta was getting fired up towards the end. Nothing he was doing was spectacular or clever, or especially clever. He was just showing nice counter right hands and getting a better read on Lee's punches, and Lee was throwing less and sort of looked like he was running lower on ideas towards the end of the fight. I think the scorecards reflect what it was, 48-47, 48-47, 49-46. I think it was a good close fight, but I think I'd probably give it to Iaquinta. And props to him. You can now rank Iaquinta, because I've always been saying it's so stupid that he's ranked on one win in the last 2 years over Diego Sanchez. But if you can beat Kevin Lee, you're pretty solid as a fighter, I think, in the lightweight division. I'm struggling to think of who they could match him against next, because you don't want to see him taking someone like Poirier or Ferguson's thunder. They shouldn't be taking a step back at this point. Well, Poirier they're going to try and slot Conor McGregor in against because they know he can beat him. But maybe Nate. I don't think Nate would take that fight, because Nate would be like, who's Al Iaquinta? Shame we never got that Felder fight, actually. But Felder's a little bit further down the pecking order now. You can't punish Iaquinta for getting the biggest win of his career by sending him back down the rankings. So tricky. I suppose you could have Barboza versus Iaquinta. They'll both be, getting ready to fight around the same time. But anyway, not a bad night of fights, I thought. We're gearing up towards the big Jones versus Gustafsson pay-per-view next week. And of course, Risen's back in action too. Let's get a quick question in before we call it for today. Hi Jack, on a recent podcast you briefly mentioned the lack of teeps in MMA. Do you think more people should use teeps to off-balance their opponents while they're kicking, or for other reasons? Or do you think that most fighters are simply... Or do you think for most fighters that they are simply too dangerous due to the wrestling threat? Or opponents being more likely to throw the big right hand as a counter? Secondly, I'm a former Patreon boy who had to unsubscribe when I went back to uni, I remember, to save money. But I hear you are going to be putting your old books up on Patreon. Will it be full copies or just excerpts? Finally, do you play UFC 3 on the PS4? And if so, are you willing to play with fans? I am a fellow Bisping at light heavyweight user. Cheers, Josh. Last question first. Yes, I do play on the PS4. I'll probably make a special account to play with fellow fight fans. At the moment, I mainly play. I play a lot of Sage Northcutt. I was going to be Chomo's Choice, but I don't think they let me have that as a name. And what else do? I play Frankie Edgar, and I just smash Zabits. And then I play some CM Punk just to humiliate people. But that way, kind of backfires if you meet anyone good because he has such bad stats. So back to the Teep. Yeah, the Teep. That was very high. Sorry, the Teep. I think when people think of a Teep, like a lot of people think of Pat Smith run out of the gate and hammer the dude in the gut with a knock the door down front kick. When I say Teep a lot of the time, and I'm talking about off-balancing opponents, watch a really good Thai, or a pair of really good Thais, ideally, really good kickers. If you match them against each other in a Muay Thai match, there's a lot of just nudging the other dude in the hip with your foot, basically. It's more stepping on the opponent than it is like slamming in a strike. And those are the sort of things that you don't really see in MMA. Quite interesting. Benson Henderson did it, and someone else did it the other day too. But when guys hit the fence, if the opponent's really running in on them, they'll brace one foot basically against the fence, on the floor against the fence, not like standing on the fence. But and then they'll push kick with the other leg while standing on one leg. Because if the opponent runs into you, if you're on one leg kicking and your foot's under you and you're out in range, you're going to get knocked over if the opponent runs in hard. But if the fence is on your back and you're right up against it and you lift your leg up, they're not going to crumple your leg. The only thing that can happen is it'll stop them. So it works really well in that instance. I think Benson Henderson did it to Brandon Thatch, who had an enormous amount of size on him. So, you can take some weight on your leg like that, and also it allowed him to escape off the fence immediately afterwards. I'd like to see more snap kicks and front kicks like that, but as weapons out of range. But I think I don't know if there are any kickers who are like busy enough that the sort of standing on one leg, nudging them sort of teeps are going to be particularly useful. I think it's very much sport-specific thing. It's very useful in sports where you're not going to be worried about getting knocked on the floor, or rather knocked off balance, but you are trying to stop the opponent from kicking you, and they're kicking frequently. I don't know. I still love the front kicks with both legs, but I think the context makes a big difference, and there are a lot of different types of front kick. I think a good hard push kick is always going to be useful. A good hard snap kick is always going to be useful. I don't know about the little sort of nudging ones in the MMA context. And then what was the second part of that question? Old books going up on Patreon. Yeah, it's not going to be the same books. What I'm going to be doing is, or what I have been working on recently, is rewriting the 3 that I put out all those years ago into one book and sort of like wrapping it all up nicely, looking at everything through the spectrum, through the lens of what top fighters do. It's not me saying this is how you should do it, because I've never really believed in like should stuff, and I don't think I'm qualified enough to be like telling anyone how they should do anything anyway. I'm very much of the belief of, look at this cool shit that so-and-so does. Here's why it appears to work for them. Up to you if you want to try it. Don't blame me if you get hurt doing it. So yeah, it's going to be sort of like the studies, but we're going to update it with some new fighters. We're going to look at some of the, get a little bit more detailed on a few of the guys we touched on before. And, particularly with people like Anderson Silva, who's the first one that I'm doing, he's continued on, and while he's been losing fights lately, he's been doing some interesting stuff. One of the techniques that we listed in the first advanced striking was the back elbow, and I didn't really get to talk about them much either. It was like little bits of writing and some photos. So what I want to be doing in this one is putting in some footwork diagrams, some diagrams of the technique, some explanation and some history on when strikes, the meta of the time. And with Anderson Silva, I remember specifically in the first advanced striking, we were talking about the Tony Strickland elbow and how it's like hand trap, drop the lead hand down below the eye line, come up through the blind angle with the elbow. And that was all very well and good, but in recent years, Silva and now other guys have found that the shoulder roll plays into the counter upward elbow much better than just looking to drop your hands below the opponent's eye line as you walk at them and try and back elbow them that way. So you've got interesting things like that we're going to build on and look at how some of these guys have developed since advanced striking came out, like, I don't know, best part of 10 years ago, maybe 7, I can't remember. But yeah, I'm just going to be throwing bits of it up for the Patreon boys each month, hopefully. And, no pressure to get in on the Patreon, because eventually I'll release it as a book, but, like, it's something that I'm going to be doing just along the way. If I finish some sections, I'll put them up for the Patreon boys just as an added thing to thank the Patreon boys more, because they make this podcast possible. Cheers, Josh. Hey, Jack, big fan of the podcast and especially the history episodes. Hey, good man. Really love the Opium War episodes and looking forward to the Ali Liston episode dropping on the 26th, as I said already. I was wondering if you'd ever considered doing history episodes on pro wrestling, perhaps taking a look at the early days of pro wrestling in the UK, the US, Japan, and Mexico, maybe an episode for each. Anyway, really love all the work. Thanks for the great content, Seth. Yes, I've had a lot of positive feedback on last week's episode, normal episode, when we were talking about pro wrestling stuff. I thought I talked about it like extensively on the podcast before, but the other thing, there's a lot of people out there who are doing stuff on the history of pro wrestling. What Culture puts up a list with stuff that they've used before every single week, and Cultaholic, and people like Brian Zane putting out great stuff too. But there's a lot of people out there talking about the history of pro wrestling, and it's a pretty saturated market. It is a fascinating subject. One of my favourite books I've read recently was the Fall of WCW. WCW is amazing, and I think every MMA promoter should be forced to read it, because it is just how you can waste all your money on gimmicks and old stars instead of building a new product. But yeah, I mean, I think it would be very interesting to do some stuff on the history of pro wrestling, but the thing about the history of pro wrestling is that it's not like an event, I tend to go very small scale, like specifically a fight or a couple of fights important in one person's career, or I go big scale and I do the Taiping War, which is 15 years, and you got many accounts of that. I think the thing with pro wrestling is that everyone's book is an individual memoir of their own life. I have not seen too many books on like an overall history of pro wrestling or an era of pro wrestling. So it'd be interesting to do. Actually, the Dynamite Kid died the other day, just on the subject of people's own memoirs and stuff like that. He's one of the ones who everyone says, oh, what a great wrestler he was. He was incredible in the ring, but he was a piece of shit outside it. And like Squared Circle, the pro wrestling subreddit, which I love, but the day after the day that the Dynamite Kid died, it was like, I'm very lucky I can separate Dynamite Kid from Davey, whatever his name was. And you're like, well, that was Benoit's failure. He shouldn't have wrestled under the name Chris Benoit. There is, I'm very much on the side of separating artist from person. You can be an absolute piece of shit and still do something very impressive in your field, John Jones. But it was just hilarious watching people who are, oh my god, Benoit, let's never even speak of him again, and then being like, no, I can respect that the Dynamite Kid was a different character to whoever he was outside the ring. Right, I reckon that'll take us over the line for our pre-Christmas episode. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas. I am not at all religious, but I do appreciate seeing all the family. And it's just a nice time of year. You just feel happy in the middle of a really bleak winter, and then we've also got the impending disaster of Brexit going on over here. So it might be our last nice one, but it'll be good to see everyone and catch up. So if you want to get in on the Patreon and get in the history episode, which I managed to plug a surprising number of times before getting here today, I don't know how I did that. Go ahead and do that, because on Boxing Day, I think we'll probably return. I will get a pre-Jones Gustafson podcast out, but I don't think I'll do it before Boxing Day. And Boxing Day is when I'm going to release Liston versus Ali, Ali versus Liston, whatever way around you want it. So get in on that. And if you've got a question to send a podcast, fightsconebipodcast@gmail.com. If you want to keep up with what I'm doing at any time, fightprimer.com. And Buy Notorious. I haven't said that one in a while, but do Buy Notorious. I'm your boy Jack Slack. I was about to say it's been a wonderful year, but we're going to get another one in before the end of the year. But I hope you have a fantastic time, and I'm going to get offensively drunk. Cheers. Santa bless.